Hello there, and welcome to Cosmic Dreams Universe. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe the day felt ordinary, routine, the same familiar sequence of things that days tend to be. Or maybe something about today left a residue, a weight you haven't quite set down yet. Either way, you made it here, to this moment, to this particular quietness at the end of a day that is now behind you. Whatever brought you here, this moment is yours. You have nothing left to do, nothing to check, nothing to prepare. So let yourself settle into wherever you are right now. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath find its own slow rhythm. Let the tension in your face soften, the way it does when no one is watching and nothing is required. Because tonight, we're going a long way back. Not just decades or centuries, thousands of years. Back to the world before the world we know. To the cities that rose from sand and river and stone. To the people who built without machines and mapped stars without telescopes. Who worshipped gods we no longer remember and wrote in languages that took centuries to decode. We're going into the ancient world, the world of Egypt and Mesopotamia, of Rome and Greece, of the Indus Valley and the Maya and the Zhou dynasty and the Phoenicians. The world of empires that lasted longer than anything we have built, of ideas that were so good they are still with us, of people who were, in every way that matters, exactly like us, curious and creative and frightened and hopeful, building their brief lives in the shadow of the same sky. Ancient civilizations are not just history, they are us, seen from a distance, our longest memory, the deep roots of everything we think of as civilization: law, writing, mathematics, philosophy, medicine, art, religion, architecture. Almost everything that makes human life recognizably human began in the ancient world, or was shaped by it, or was passed down through it. Tonight, we'll drift through 100 quiet facts about these ancient worlds. Some will be astonishing. Some will be familiar, but seen from a new angle. Some will be small and human, and unexpectedly moving. A detail about what people ate, or how they mourned their dead, or what they found funny. Because that is what history is at its best. Not just kings and wars and dates, but the texture of life. The ordinary and extraordinary woven together. The evidence that people have always been people, full of the same questions and the same needs, and the same longing to understand the world and leave something behind. And before we begin, if these slow, curious journeys help you rest, if they give your mind somewhere wide and quiet to drift, consider liking and subscribing to Cosmic Dreams Universe. It helps others find their way here, one curious mind at a time. Now, let's go back. The ancient Egyptians had over 2,000 gods. Not 2 or 10 or 100, more than 2,000. Deities of every conceivable kind, governing every aspect of life and death and the natural world. Gods of the sun and moon and stars. Gods of the Nile and the harvest and the desert wind. Gods of childbirth and grief and justice and magic. Gods who took the form of animals, or humans, or strange combinations of both. This was not confusion or contradiction. It was a vast, intricate system of meaning-making, a way of mapping the complexity of the world onto figures with names and stories and relationships. Every force that mattered in Egyptian life had a face and a personality and a ritual associated with it. Ra, the sun god, traveled across the sky each day in his solar bark and descended each night into the underworld, where he had to navigate a series of dangers before rising again at dawn. The story of the sun's daily journey was not just astronomy. It was theology. It was comfort. It was the assurance that tomorrow would come. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of death and embalming, weighed the hearts of the dead against a feather. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the soul passed into the afterlife. If it was heavier, burdened by the weight of misdeeds, it was devoured by a beast called Amit. This is not superstition in the crude sense. It is one of the earliest recorded ideas about moral accountability after death, about the weight of how you lived. The Egyptians were not primitive. They were human in the fullest sense, grappling with the same questions about existence and justice and what happens when we die that we are still grappling with today. The pyramids were already ancient when Cleopatra was born. This is a fact that stops people when they first encounter it, because it reframes how we think about the ancient world. Cleopatra VII, the famous queen of Egypt, was born in 69 BCE. The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2560 BCE. That means that when Cleopatra was alive, the Great Pyramid was already approximately 2,500 years old. To put that in perspective, Cleopatra is closer in time to us than she is to the builders of the Great Pyramid. We are, in a sense, more contemporaneous with Cleopatra than Cleopatra was with Khufu. The ancient world was not a single era. It was itself a long sequence of eras, each one ancient to the ones that followed. The Egyptians who lived in Cleopatra's time looked back on the pyramid builders the way we might look back on the builders of medieval cathedrals, as distant ancestors whose work was astonishing and whose world was quite different from their own. And the pyramid builders looked back on their own ancient past. Egypt had already been a civilization for centuries before the pyramids were built. They had their own history, their own traditions, their own sense of a past that was worth preserving. The ancient world was deep, not a single moment, but a vast accumulation of moments, each generation living in the shadow of what came before. The Great Pyramid was the tallest human-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. Built around 2560 BCE, the Great Pyramid of Giza stood approximately 146.5 meters tall at its completion. For almost 4 millennia, from its construction until the completion of the Lincoln Cathedral in England around 1311 CE, nothing built by human hands rose higher. 4,000 years. The entire span of recorded history from the birth of writing to the Middle Ages, and the Great Pyramid was the tallest thing humans had ever made. We tend to think of ancient construction as primitive by modern standards, and in terms of tools and technology, it was simpler. But the scale of ambition and achievement represented by the pyramids was not primitive in any meaningful sense. It was extraordinary. It remains extraordinary. The Great Pyramid contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2.5 and 15 tons. The base is level to within 2.1 centimeters across its entire 230-meter length. The four sides are oriented to the cardinal directions, with an accuracy of within a fraction of a degree. These are not the achievements of people who lacked intelligence or sophistication. They are the achievements of a culture that had developed advanced mathematics, precise astronomical observation, sophisticated logistics, and the organizational capacity to direct tens of thousands of workers over decades. How exactly they moved the stones remains debated. Ramps of various configurations, sledges, water lubrication. No single explanation has been fully proven. The exact method is still, in some ways, a mystery. But the achievement is not a mystery. It is there. It has been there for 4,500 years. It will outlast almost everything we build today. Ancient Mesopotamia gave us the concept of writing. The world was different before writing, profoundly different. Not just administratively, but cognitively. Writing does not just record thought. It changes how thought works. It makes certain kinds of complex reasoning possible that oral culture cannot sustain. It creates a memory that extends beyond individual human lives. It makes history possible. Writing was invented, as far as we know, in ancient Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq. Around 3200 BCE, the Sumerians developed a system of symbols pressed into clay tablets with a reed stylus. The symbols began as simple pictographs, direct representations of the things they depicted. Over centuries, they evolved into a system of abstract signs representing sounds and syllables, the script we call cuneiform. The earliest surviving written records are not poems or histories or religious texts. They are receipts, accounts of grain and sheep and labor, lists of who owned what and who owed what to whom. The first things humans chose to write down were transactions. This is both amusing and profound. Writing was born out of the need to keep records, to track economic activity, to maintain the complexity of a growing urban economy. The first scribes were accountants. But writing, once invented, became something much more. Laws, stories, prayers, astronomical observations, medical treatments, philosophical arguments, all found their way into cuneiform. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written in Mesopotamia more than 4,000 years ago, is one of the oldest surviving works of literature. It is the story of a king who loses his closest friend and journeys to the ends of the earth searching for immortality. It is, in other words, a story about grief and the fear of death and the human refusal to accept mortality. Nothing about that story is ancient. It is as contemporary as anything written today. The ancient Romans had running water, flush toilets, and underfloor heating. The technological gap between the ancient world and our own is often overstated. While the Romans did not have electricity or digital technology, they achieved levels of engineering comfort that would not be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. Roman aqueducts carried fresh water from distant sources into cities with populations of hundreds of thousands. The Aqua Claudia, completed in 52 CE, stretched for nearly 70 kilometers. The water it carried flowed under gravity through precisely engineered channels, arrived at the city at elevated positions, and was distributed through a network of lead and terracotta pipes to public fountains, bathhouses, and the homes of the wealthy. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewage systems, drained the marshy valleys of Rome and carried waste into the Tiber. It was built in the 6th century BCE, and parts of it are still in use today. Roman bathhouses, the thermae, were public institutions of enormous sophistication. The baths of Caracalla, built in the early 3rd century CE, could accommodate 1,600 bathers simultaneously. They included not just bathing rooms at different temperatures, hot, warm, and cold, but also libraries, gardens, exercise rooms, and spaces for socializing. Wealthy Roman homes were heated by hypocausts, systems of raised floors and hollow walls through which hot air from furnaces circulated. The floor of a well-heated Roman villa was warm to walk on in winter. The system was not replicated on any significant scale in Europe until the 20th century. The fall of Rome in the 5th century CE was, among other things, the loss of this accumulated engineering knowledge. Cities that had had running water and heated buildings were, within a few generations, doing without. The Middle Ages were, in part, a long process of slowly rediscovering what Rome had known. The ancient Greeks invented democracy, but it was very different from what we practice today. Athens in the 5th century BCE developed what they called democratia, rule by the people. It was a radical idea. Power would not rest with a king or a tyrant or an aristocracy. It would rest with the citizens. But the citizens of Athens were a specific and limited group. Women were not citizens. Slaves, who made up a significant portion of the population, were not citizens. Foreigners living in Athens, even those who had lived there for generations, not citizens. Citizenship was restricted to free adult males born of Athenian parents. By modern standards, Athenian democracy was not very democratic. It excluded the majority of the people who lived in Athens. But what it did include was remarkable. Free adult male citizens, estimated at perhaps 30 to 40,000 people in a city of several hundred thousand, had the direct right to participate in the assembly, to vote on laws and policies, to serve as jurors, to hold office. Not through representatives, directly. Every citizen who showed up to the assembly had a vote. The assembly met frequently, sometimes as often as every 10 days. It debated and voted on matters of war and peace, taxation, public building projects, and foreign policy. The votes were by show of hands. Any citizen could speak. This direct participation in governance was genuinely revolutionary. The idea that ordinary people, not just elites, should have a say in how their city is governed was new. And while Athenian democracy was limited in ways that make modern democrats uncomfortable, it planted a seed that would take over 2,000 years to fully flower. Ancient China invented paper, printing, gunpowder, and the compass. These 4 inventions, known as the 4 great inventions of ancient China, changed the world in ways that are difficult to overstate. Paper was invented in China during the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, using materials like bark, hemp, and rags. Before paper, records were kept on bamboo strips, silk, and oracle bones. Paper was lighter, cheaper, and easier to produce. It spread westward through trade routes and eventually replaced other writing surfaces across the world. Printing, specifically woodblock printing, was developed in China during the Tang Dynasty, around the 7th century CE. Movable type, using individual characters that could be rearranged, was invented during the Song Dynasty in the 11th century CE, approximately 4 centuries before Gutenberg developed similar technology in Europe. The spread of printing made books more accessible and literacy more widespread. Gunpowder was discovered by Chinese alchemists in the 9th century CE during the Tang Dynasty, apparently while searching for an elixir of immortality. The early applications were fireworks and signal rockets. Military applications followed. When gunpowder technology reached Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, it transformed warfare, eventually making the armored knight obsolete and the castle vulnerable in new ways. The magnetic compass, in a primitive form, was known in China by the 2nd century BCE. By the 11th century, Chinese navigators were using magnetic compasses to determine direction at sea. The technology spread to the Islamic world, and from there to Europe, where it transformed maritime navigation and enabled the age of exploration. These 4 technologies, developed in China over centuries, shaped the entire subsequent history of the world. The spread of literacy through paper and printing, the transformation of warfare through gunpowder, the exploration of the globe through the compass. The modern world, in ways both obvious and subtle, was made possible by ancient Chinese innovation. The Indus Valley Civilization had urban planning more advanced than many cities today. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished from approximately 2600 to 1900 BCE in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, is one of the least known and most remarkable of the ancient civilizations. At its height, it was larger in geographic extent than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. Its two largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, each had populations estimated at 30 to 50,000 people, and they were planned with a sophistication that astonishes archaeologists today. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro were laid out in a grid pattern, oriented to the cardinal directions. The city was divided into blocks, each with consistent widths and straight crossings. This is urban planning, deliberate, systematic, applied to a city of tens of thousands of people 4,000 years ago. Every house in Mohenjo-Daro had access to a sophisticated drainage system. Wastewater from bathrooms and kitchens flowed through clay pipes into covered drains that ran along the streets. The drains were large enough for workers to enter and clean them. Individual houses were connected to this public sewage network. This level of sanitary infrastructure was not matched in many European cities until the 19th century CE, merely 4,000 years later. The Indus Valley Civilization also developed its own writing system, one that has not yet been deciphered. We have thousands of inscriptions on seals and pottery and clay tablets. We know the script exists. We cannot yet read it. The people of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa left behind elaborate cities, standardized weights and measures, sophisticated crafts and trade networks, and a script we cannot read. They remain, in many ways, a civilization of mysteries. Ancient Rome was one of the first multicultural societies on Earth. At its height, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain in the northwest to Mesopotamia in the southeast, from the Rhine in the north to North Africa in the south. It encompassed an extraordinary diversity of peoples, languages, religions, and cultures. And Rome, for much of its history, was surprisingly inclusive by ancient standards. Citizenship in Rome was not restricted by ethnicity. Over time, it was extended to conquered peoples across the empire. The Emperor Caracalla, in 212 CE, granted Roman citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire, regardless of where they had been born or what language they spoke. Rome's armies drew soldiers from across the empire. Legions included Gauls, Syrians, Africans, Britons, and Egyptians. The emperor himself was not always Roman in the ethnic sense. The Severan dynasty, which ruled from 193 to 235 CE, was of North African and Syrian origin. Emperors from Spain, from the Balkans, from the eastern provinces, all ruled the empire at various points. The city of Rome itself was one of the most diverse cities in the ancient world. People from across the Mediterranean and beyond crowded its streets. Greek, Aramaic, Latin, and dozens of other languages were spoken in its markets and neighborhoods. The city's religious landscape included traditional Roman polytheism, mystery cults from the East, Judaism, early Christianity, and imported Egyptian religion. The goddess Isis, Egyptian in origin, was one of the most popular deities in the Roman Empire for centuries. Mithraism, originating in Persia, was widespread among Roman soldiers. The diversity of spiritual life in Rome was extraordinary. This was not always harmonious. Tensions existed. Persecution occurred. But the basic model of a civilization that absorbed and incorporated diverse peoples and their cultures was genuinely novel in the ancient world, and its legacy is still with us. The ancient Maya were advanced astronomers. The Maya civilization, centered in the Yucatan Peninsula and surrounding regions of what is now Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize reached its height between approximately 250 and 900 CE, and one of its most remarkable achievements was astronomical. The Maya tracked the movements of celestial bodies with extraordinary precision, using only naked eye observation. They calculated the length of the solar year to within a fraction of a day of its true value. They tracked the cycles of Venus with exceptional accuracy, knowing its synodic period, the time it takes to return to the same position relative to the Sun, to within a few minutes of the actual value. The Maya developed an elaborate calendar system, actually multiple interlocking calendar systems that tracked different cycles simultaneously. The Tzolk'in was a 260-day ritual calendar. The Hab was a 365-day solar calendar. Together, they created a cycle of approximately 52 years, called the calendar round, after which the combination of days would begin to repeat. For tracking longer periods, the Maya used the long count, a system that could mark specific days within a cycle of approximately 5,125 years. It was the end of one such cycle in December 2012 that was misinterpreted by some as a Maya prediction of the end of the world. The Maya themselves said nothing of the kind. It was simply the end of one great cycle and the beginning of the next. The precision of Maya astronomy, achieved without telescopes or electronic instruments, through careful, long-term observation and sophisticated mathematics, is one of the remarkable intellectual achievements of the pre-Columbian Americas. The ancient Greeks believed in a round Earth long before Columbus. The popular story that Columbus proved the Earth was round by sailing west is simply wrong. The spherical shape of the Earth was known to educated Greeks by the 4th century BCE and possibly earlier. Pythagoras, in the 6th century BCE, is often credited with being among the first to propose a spherical Earth. Aristotle, in the 4th century BCE, offered several observational arguments for a round Earth. The circular shadow the Earth casts on the Moon during lunar eclipses, the fact that ships disappear over the horizon hull first before their masts, the different star constellations visible from different latitudes. Most dramatically, around 240 BCE, the Greek scholar Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. He knew that in Syene, in southern Egypt, the sun was directly overhead at noon on the summer solstice, shining straight down a well. At the same time in Alexandria, a city roughly north of Syene, a vertical stick cast a shadow at an angle of approximately 7 degrees. Using the angle, the known distance between the two cities, and basic geometry, Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference. His result, depending on which ancient unit of length he used, was somewhere between 39,000 and 46,000 kilometers. The actual value is approximately 40,075 kilometers. An ancient Greek scholar, working with a stick and a shadow and the distance between two cities, calculated the circumference of the Earth to within a few percent of the correct value, more than 17 centuries before Columbus sailed. The educated medieval Europeans who argued with Columbus were not arguing about whether the Earth was round. They knew it was round. They were arguing, correctly, that Columbus had underestimated how big it was, and therefore how far away Asia would be by the western route. Cleopatra spoke 9 languages. She is remembered primarily for her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and for the drama of her death. But Cleopatra VII was one of the most capable rulers of the ancient world, and one of her most remarkable achievements was linguistic. Cleopatra was the first ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt to actually learn to speak Egyptian. The Ptolemies, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries before her reign. During all that time, the ruling class had spoken Greek and left communication with the native Egyptian population to intermediaries. Cleopatra changed this. She learned Egyptian, not just as a formal language, but as a spoken tongue she could use directly with her subjects. And she did not stop there. Ancient sources credit her with speaking up to 9 languages in total, including Egyptian, Greek, Ethiopian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, and several others. This was not a superficial accomplishment. Speaking these languages meant she could conduct diplomacy directly, without interpreters who might shade meaning or serve their own interests. It meant she could speak to the people of her kingdom in their own tongues. It was a political tool of enormous value. Cleopatra was also a scholar. She wrote medical texts. She was knowledgeable in philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy. The image of her as primarily a seductress, an image promoted by Roman propaganda and later amplified by centuries of storytelling, obscures the reality of a highly educated, politically astute, strategically brilliant ruler who kept Egypt independent against the most powerful empire the world had yet seen for 20 years. The ancient Romans loved fast food. They had something remarkably similar to our modern street food culture. Thermopolia, the Roman equivalent of a fast food restaurant, were ubiquitous in Roman cities. Excavations at Pompeii, the city buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE and preserved in extraordinary detail, have revealed dozens of thermopolia. A thermopolium was typically a narrow shop with a counter facing the street. The counter had circular holes in it, into which large ceramic containers called dolia were set. The dolia contained hot food and drinks, kept warm by hot water or coals beneath the counter. Passers-by could stop, order, eat standing at the counter, or take food away and move on. The food in Roman thermopolia included hot stews, cooked vegetables, wine, and various prepared dishes. Not unlike a modern fast food counter in structure, if not in menu. Pompeii alone had approximately 80 thermopolia for a population of around 20,000 people. That is one fast food establishment for every 250 people, a ratio not far from some modern cities. Archaeologists analyzing residue in the dolia at Pompeii have found evidence of duck, pig, goat, fish, and various legumes. They found traces of fermented fish sauce, the Roman condiment called garum, which was used in cooking the way we use ketchup or soy sauce. They found wine mixed with other substances. The Romans ate out routinely and casually. They did not necessarily have kitchens in their homes, particularly in apartment buildings called insulae, where space was limited. The city was their kitchen. The thermopolia were their daily meals. Fast food is not a modern invention. It is at least 2,000 years old. Ancient Mesopotamia had the world's first laws. The Code of Hammurabi, written around 1754 BCE during the reign of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, is one of the oldest deciphered writings of significant length in the world, and one of the earliest examples of a written legal code. The code is carved on a basalt stele, nearly 2.5 meters tall, now housed in the Louvre in Paris. At the top is a carved image of Hammurabi receiving the laws from the sun god Shamash. Below, in cuneiform, are 282 laws covering an extraordinary range of situations. The laws address trade, property rights, marriage and divorce, adoption, wages, professional conduct, and crimes and punishments. Some are strikingly familiar. A builder who constructs a house that collapses and kills the owner shall be put to death. A merchant who charges interest above the legal rate shall lose the debt entirely. A physician who causes the death of a patient through surgery shall have his hand cut off. The principle of proportional justice, that the punishment should fit the crime, runs through the code. And while some of the punishments are harsh by modern standards, the underlying idea that there should be consistent, known rules that apply to everyone within the society is one of the foundations of civilization as we understand it. The code also shows a sophisticated understanding of different social classes and different economic situations. Penalties varied depending on whether the offender was a free citizen, a freed person, or a slave. Wages were set by law and differed by occupation. Hammurabi was not inventing the idea of law from scratch. Earlier Mesopotamian legal codes existed, but his is the most complete and the most beautifully preserved, and it stands as one of the great monuments of early human governance. The idea that power should be constrained by known rules, that a king cannot simply do whatever he wishes without consequence, that law should be public and consistent. These ideas, planted in the ancient Near East 4,000 years ago, are still the foundation of every legal system in the world today. The ancient Egyptians used contraception. This surprises many people because it seems somehow too modern, too practical. But the ancient Egyptians had medical texts, the Ebers Papyrus and the Kahun Papyrus among them, that describe methods of contraception dating back to 1850 BCE and earlier. These methods included pessaries made from a mixture of crocodile dung, honey, and natron, a naturally occurring salt. They included drinks made from certain plants. They included physical barrier methods made from linen. Were these effective? Some possibly were, or at least partially effective. Some were not. The crocodile dung pessary, for example, may have had some spermicidal effect due to the acidity of the mixture, though ancient dung would have been quite different from fresh dung in chemical composition. The point is not primarily the efficacy of specific methods, it is the understanding they reveal. The ancient Egyptians understood the connection between sex and pregnancy. They understood that pregnancy could be prevented through various interventions. They developed, tested, and recorded these methods over generations. They passed them down through medical texts that treated the subject with the same practical seriousness as treatments for disease or injury. Family planning is not a modern concept. The desire to have some control over reproduction is as old as human consciousness. And the ancient Egyptians developed practical, if imperfect, responses to that desire, almost 4,000 years before the modern era. Ancient Rome had a complicated relationship with cats. While ancient Egypt revered cats to a degree that made harming one a serious crime, Rome's relationship with cats was more practical and less religious. Cats came to Rome from Egypt and were valued primarily as pest controllers. They kept granaries and warehouses free of rodents. They were practical animals, useful animals, but not sacred ones. And yet, Roman art shows cats in domestic settings. Mosaics from Pompeii depict cats hunting birds and fish in scenes of considerable charm. Cats appear in Roman literature, sometimes with affection. They were household companions, even if they were not worshipped. What is perhaps most interesting is what the Romans thought distinguished cats from other animals. Writers noted the cat's independence, its refusal to be fully domesticated in the way a dog is. A cat came and went as it pleased. It could not be owned in the same way. It retained something of the wild. Romans, who had strong opinions about self-sufficiency and independence, seem to have found something admirable in this. The cat was a companion that chose to be there, rather than one bound by training or dependency. This reading of the cat as an animal that maintains its autonomy even within human habitation is remarkably consistent with how people think about cats today. 2,000 years have not changed the essential nature of cats, or of how humans perceive them. The Silk Road connected ancient civilizations across thousands of miles. The Silk Road was not a single road. It was a network of overland and maritime trade routes connecting China in the east to the Mediterranean world in the west, passing through Central Asia, Persia, Arabia, and the Indian subcontinent. At its most active during the Han Dynasty in China and the Roman Empire in the west, the Silk Road carried not just goods, but ideas, technologies, diseases, and people across an extraordinary distance. From China came silk, which gave the route its name. Silk was so prized in Rome that the Senate at one point tried to ban its import, not because of its cost, though it was extraordinarily expensive, but because wearing transparent silk garments was considered indecent. The ban failed. Romans loved silk. From the west came glass, which the Chinese found remarkable. Chinese craftsmen could not initially replicate the clarity and technique of Roman blown glass. Roman glassware was exotic and expensive in China. From India came spices, cotton, and gemstones. From Persia came horses, which the Chinese valued highly for their military utility. From Central Asia came metalwork, carpets, and horses of different breeds. But the most consequential things that traveled the Silk Road may not have been commodities at all. Buddhism spread from India to China along the Silk Road, carried by monks and merchants. Islam would later spread along similar routes. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge moved in multiple directions. The papermaking techniques of China eventually reached the Islamic world, where they were refined and passed to Europe. The Silk Road was one of history's greatest engines of cultural exchange, and it was operating at significant scale 2,000 years ago. Ancient peoples were not shorter than modern people. This is a common misconception. The image of medieval or ancient people as significantly shorter than us is largely a myth, or at least an exaggeration. Archaeological evidence from ancient skeletal remains suggests that average heights in antiquity were not dramatically different from today. Roman soldiers, based on skeletal and written evidence, averaged somewhere between 5 feet 4 inches and 5 feet 7 inches. Roughly 163 to 170 centimeters. Not dramatically different from the European average of a few centuries ago, though below the modern average in many countries. Average height declined somewhat during the Middle Ages, likely due to changes in diet, disease burden, and living conditions. And it has increased significantly in the 20th century in many countries, largely due to improved nutrition in childhood. But the people of ancient Rome or ancient Egypt were not the stunted, diminutive figures sometimes imagined. They were, by and large, within a few inches of modern heights. They wore clothes and shoes and armor that fit bodies shaped much like ours. The bones of ancient people tell us this. The doors of ancient buildings confirm it. The armor and equipment found in ancient contexts is sized for people not dramatically different from us. We look at ancient buildings and sometimes feel they are smaller than expected. But this is often a function of different spatial priorities, different uses of space, different expectations about personal space, not a function of smaller bodies. Ancient people were not another species. They were us, in different circumstances. Ancient Sparta had 2 kings ruling simultaneously. The Spartan system of government was one of the most unusual in the ancient world. At its head were 2 kings ruling simultaneously, drawn from two royal families, the Agiads and the Eurypontids. Having two kings sounds like a recipe for conflict, and occasionally it was. But the Spartans seem to have designed it as a check on the power of each. Neither king could act unilaterally on the most important matters. The dual kingship created a built-in balance. The kings were not absolute monarchs. They served primarily as military commanders in time of war. In peacetime, significant power rested with the Council of Elders, the Gerousia, composed of men over 60, and with the board of 5 magistrates called the ephors, who were elected annually and had authority to oversee and even challenge the kings. Spartan society was organized around the production of warriors to a degree unprecedented in the Greek world. Male citizens were taken from their families at age 7 and entered a rigorous state education system called the agoge. They lived in communal barracks, underwent harsh physical training, learned to endure pain and deprivation, and were not permitted to live with their wives until age 30. The result was arguably the most effective military force in the ancient Greek world. Spartan hoplites were widely regarded as the finest soldiers of their era. At the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, a force of 300 Spartans, along with several thousand allied Greek soldiers, held a narrow mountain pass against a massive Persian army for 3 days, inflicting enormous casualties before being outflanked and killed. The 300 Spartans of Thermopylae became one of the most celebrated military stands in history. Not because they won, they didn't, but because of the discipline, courage, and commitment to their city that they demonstrated. The ancient world had its own equivalent of newspapers. In Rome, public information was disseminated through a system called the Acta Diurna, the Daily Acts, said to have been instituted by Julius Caesar in 59 BCE. The Acta Diurna were official public notices, written on stone or metal and posted in prominent public places in Rome. They recorded the results of important court cases, births and deaths in prominent families, military victories, significant public events, and decisions of the Senate and other governing bodies. Private individuals could employ scribes to copy the Acta Diurna and send the copies to friends, family, or business associates in other cities. This created a circulation system, not unlike the distribution of a newspaper, whereby news from Rome spread through the empire. The Acta Diurna did not survive. We know about them from references in other ancient texts, including letters by Cicero, who mentions sending copies to friends or receiving them from correspondents in Rome. Ancient Greece had something similar in the form of public inscriptions and proclamations. Important decisions, treaties, and laws were inscribed on stone and set up in public places where citizens could read them. The agora, the central public space of a Greek city, was often lined with these inscriptions. The idea of a public information system, of making important news and decisions available to the general population, is not modern. It is ancient. The specific technologies have changed. The underlying impulse to know what is happening and to share information publicly is very old indeed. Ancient Egyptian workers went on strike. In approximately 1170 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses III, a group of workmen building royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings stopped working and sat down. They refused to work until their wages, which had been delayed, were paid. This event is recorded in the Turin Strike Papyrus, one of the oldest recorded labor disputes in history. The workmen were part of a village called Deir el-Medina, a community of skilled craftsmen and their families who were housed, fed, and supplied by the state in exchange for their work on the royal tombs. The workmen's complaint was simple and legitimate. Their rations of grain and other supplies had not arrived on time. They were hungry. They could not work without food. So they stopped, walked out of their work area, and sat in protest at the mortuary temples nearby. Their protest was successful. The authorities negotiated with them and eventually provided the promised rations. The workers returned to their tombs. This is not just an interesting historical footnote. It reveals something important about ancient Egyptian society. These were not slaves. The workers of Deir el-Medina were skilled professionals, paid in goods rather than money, but with recognized rights and expectations. When those expectations were violated, they had the cultural and social space to protest collectively and to achieve a result. The ancient world was not simply a world of passive masses controlled by all-powerful rulers. Ordinary people had interests, organized themselves, and sometimes successfully pushed back when those interests were violated. Ancient Greek athletes competed in the Olympics completely naked. The ancient Olympic Games, held at Olympia in Greece every 4 years from 776 BCE, were a major religious and athletic event. Athletes from across the Greek world competed in running, wrestling, chariot racing, discus throwing, javelin, and other events. And they competed, according to ancient sources, in the nude. The word gymnasium comes from the Greek gymnos, meaning naked. The gymnasium was literally a place where you trained naked. The reasons for this practice are debated. Some ancient sources suggest it began after an athlete's loincloth fell off during a race and he won anyway, after which nudity became customary. Others suggest it was a deliberate aesthetic and symbolic choice. The ideal of the human body, perfectly trained and proportioned, was a central value in Greek culture. Competing naked displayed and celebrated that ideal. Whatever the reason, the practice was established and unremarkable by Greek standards. Athletic nudity was simply part of the culture of physical competition. Women were not permitted to watch the Olympic Games, on pain of death, according to some sources. Whether this rule was strictly enforced is unknown. But women had their own separate athletic festival at Olympia, the Heraea, in honor of the goddess Hera, where they competed in foot races. The ancient Olympics continued for over 1,000 years, until they were abolished by the Roman Emperor Theodosius I in 393 CE as part of a broader suppression of pagan religious practices. They were revived in 1896, and the modern games continue today. Ancient civilizations understood mental illness. The idea that mental illness is a purely modern recognition, or that ancient peoples attributed all abnormal behavior to supernatural causes, is too simple. The ancient Egyptians described symptoms that we would recognize as depression, as dementia, as what might today be called post-traumatic stress. The Ebers Papyrus includes descriptions of conditions affecting the mind and behavior and recommends treatments, including both physical remedies and psychological interventions. Ancient Greek physicians, particularly in the Hippocratic tradition, argued explicitly against supernatural explanations for mental illness. The Hippocratic text, On the Sacred Disease, which discusses epilepsy, argues that this condition, previously attributed to divine intervention, is a natural disease of the brain with natural causes. The author argues that all diseases have natural causes, and that attributing them to gods is both intellectually dishonest and unhelpful to patients. Hippocrates described what we would now recognize as hysteria, melancholia, mania, and phobias, and proposed explanations in terms of the balance of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The humor theory was wrong, but the impulse behind it, to find natural, physical explanations for mental states rather than supernatural ones, was scientifically correct in its approach. Ancient Rome had at least one prominent figure who wrote with remarkable insight about what we would now call depression. The philosopher Seneca, in letters written around 60 CE, describes a state of mind that sounds strikingly like clinical depression. The loss of pleasure in things, the difficulty of motivation, the heaviness of spirit, with compassion and without judgment. Ancient peoples were not ignorant of the mind's capacity for suffering. They observed it, described it, argued about its causes, and tried to treat it. The categories were different from ours. The treatments were often unhelpful or harmful. But the recognition that minds, like bodies, could be ill is ancient. The ancient world had global trade networks. We tend to think of globalization as a modern phenomenon, but the ancient world was more connected than most people realize. Roman coins have been found in India, in Southeast Asia, and in sub-Saharan Africa. Chinese silk has been found in ancient Roman graves. Spices from Southeast Asia appear in ancient Egyptian tombs. Amber from the Baltic appears in ancient Mediterranean contexts, traded through a chain of intermediaries over thousands of kilometers. The ancient world was connected by trade across distances that seem extraordinary given the technology available. Ships of the ancient Mediterranean crossed open ocean. Roman merchants traded directly with India. Indian traders reached Southeast Asia and the coasts of East Africa. Arab traders crossed the Indian Ocean and linked the worlds of Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia into a single commercial network. These networks were not merely commercial. They carried people, ideas, technologies, and diseases. The Antonine Plague, which killed millions in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century CE, was likely brought back from the East by soldiers. The Black Death of the 14th century traveled along the same Silk Road trade routes that had carried silk and spices for centuries. Trade has always carried consequences. The benefits of exchange have always been accompanied by the risks of transmission. Ancient peoples understood this, at least in practical terms. Trade was too valuable to stop, but its consequences were sometimes devastating. The ancient world was not isolated. It was interconnected in ways that shaped the history of every civilization that was part of its network. The ancient Egyptians invented toothpaste? The earliest known formula for toothpaste dates to ancient Egypt, approximately 4,000 years ago. It was a powder made from ingredients including dried iris flowers, pepper, mint, and rock salt mixed to a paste. Later Egyptian formulas, from papyri dating to around 400 CE, describe a mixture of rock salt, pepper, dried mint leaf, and iris flowers to be used with the fingers on the teeth and gums. Contemporary descriptions suggest that this formula left the mouth feeling clean and fresh. The ancient Romans used a variety of tooth-cleaning substances, including crushed bones and oyster shells for abrasion and the juice of certain plants for cleaning. Urine was also used, both human and animal, as a tooth-cleaning agent. The ammonia in urine does have some antibacterial properties, and urine was an important source of ammonia in the ancient world, used in textile processing as well as personal hygiene. Toothpicks were common across many ancient cultures. The ancient Chinese used them. The ancient Greeks used them. They appear in ancient texts and in archaeological finds with striking frequency, suggesting that food caught between teeth was as annoying in antiquity as it is today. Dental hygiene in various forms is ancient. The desire for clean teeth and fresh breath appears to be universal and very old. The specific substances used have changed. The impulse has not. Ancient Rome had a welfare system. The Roman state developed over time a system of distributing free or subsidized grain to citizens of the city of Rome. This system called the annona, or the grain dole, at its height, provided free grain to several 100,000 citizens. The origins of the grain dole lay in a law passed in 123 BCE by the reformer Gaius Gracchus, which required the state to sell grain to citizens at below market prices. Over the following centuries, the price was gradually reduced until, by the time of Julius Caesar, the grain was provided free of charge to eligible citizens. At its peak, under the empire, the grain dole fed somewhere between 200,000 and 320,000 people, approximately a quarter to a third of the city's free adult male citizen population. Recipients received a monthly ration of grain that was sufficient, when supplemented by other foods, to sustain a person. The system was expensive and was occasionally criticized, both for its cost and for its potential to create dependency. Julius Caesar, in an effort to reduce the cost, reduced the number of recipients. Augustus, the first emperor, stabilized and systematized the distribution. The grain dole was not available to slaves, freedmen, or non-citizens. It was a benefit of Roman citizenship, and its existence reflects something about the implicit social contract of Roman society. The state had obligations to its citizens. Among those obligations, at least in the city of Rome, was ensuring that citizens did not starve. The idea that a state has some responsibility for the basic subsistence of its people is not modern. It is at least 2,000 years old. Now the night has grown quieter around you. You have traveled a long way tonight, through Egypt and Mesopotamia, through Greece and Rome, through China and the Maya and the Indus Valley, and Sparta and Carthage, and all the ordinary and extraordinary places where people like us lived their lives, building their cities, writing their laws, watching their stars, feeding their children, burying their dead. People who loved and feared and wondered and grieved and celebrated. People who wanted to leave something behind, and in most cases did, in stone and clay and papyrus and the slow sediment of language and ideas that accumulated and was passed on and became, in time, us. Every idea you have ever had about justice and government and science and art and the meaning of life has ancestors in the ancient world. The categories through which you understand existence, the words you use, the stories you tell, the values you hold, all of them have roots that reach back into those ancient civilizations, into those cities of mud brick and marble and fired clay, into those conversations held by lamplight 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. You are not separate from the ancient world. You are its consequence, its inheritor, the most recent installment of a project that has been going on since humans first decided to live together in cities and govern themselves by law and explain the world through story and symbol. The ancient peoples did not know they were ancient. They were simply living their lives in the only world available to them, as fully and as meaningfully as they could. And now they are gone, most of them without names, without records, their lives known to us only through the objects they left behind and the patterns those objects reveal. But they were here. They were real. And tonight, drifting through a few of their facts and stories and achievements, you have kept them company for a little while. That matters. Not in any grand historical sense, but in the quiet human sense of remembering, of paying attention, of letting the past be present for a moment before sleep takes you. The last thing they left us is the most important. Not the pyramids, not the aqueducts, not the written laws or the philosophical texts or the astronomical calculations, not the roads or the harbors or the irrigation systems. The most important thing the ancient world left us is the knowledge that it is possible, that humans can build something complex and lasting, that cooperation on a vast scale is within our nature, that beauty and order and justice are things we are capable of reaching toward, even if we never fully reach them. The ancient world failed in many ways. Its slavery, its violence, its exclusions and its cruelties and its injustices, which were real and significant. We should not romanticize it. But it also succeeded in ways that deserve recognition and wonder. It built things that lasted. It thought thoughts that still matter. It asked questions that are still unanswered. It produced people who loved their children and grieved their dead, and looked at the night sky with the same wonder you might feel looking at it now. The ancient world was not so different from this one. People are the same across all of time. The circumstances change, the tools change, the specific beliefs and customs change. But the underlying human reality, the curiosity and the creativity and the desire to make something meaningful, that does not change. And that continuity is both humbling and comforting. Humbling because it puts our own moment in perspective. Comforting because it suggests that whatever challenges we face them as members of a very long tradition of people who have faced challenges and continued anyway. If you happen to still be awake, you can go ahead and watch the next chapter now. And if your eyes are heavy, let them close. The ancient world has waited thousands of years. It will still be there in the morning, and so will you. The ancient world had professional female doctors. Merit Ptah, who lived in ancient Egypt around 2700 BCE, is the earliest known female physician in recorded history. Her image and title appear in a tomb inscription in the Valley of the Kings. The inscription describes her as the chief physician, a title that indicates she held a position of authority in Egyptian medical practice. She was not alone. Ancient Egypt had a medical tradition that, unusually for the ancient world, allowed women to practice medicine. The Temple of Neith at Sais apparently had a school of medicine that included female students and practitioners. In ancient Greece, the situation was more complicated. Women were generally excluded from formal education and public life, but there are accounts of female physicians operating, sometimes in disguise. One story tells of a woman named Agnodike, who in the 4th century BCE disguised herself as a man to study medicine, then practiced in Athens. When she was discovered to be a woman, she was initially prosecuted, but her female patients, who had found her far less intimidating than male physicians, defended her, and the charges were eventually dropped. In the Roman world, female physicians called medici are attested in inscriptions. Some appear to have been specialists in women's health. Others treated general patients. They were not as common as male physicians, but they existed, they practiced, and they were recognized as professionals. The ancient world was not uniformly or universally patriarchal in its medical profession. Women practiced medicine openly, sometimes despite obstacles across different ancient cultures and different periods. The ancient Phoenicians gave us the alphabet. The Phoenicians were a maritime civilization based along the coast of what is now Lebanon, flourishing roughly between 1500 and 300 BCE. They were master sailors and traders, establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, including the famous city of Carthage in North Africa. But their most enduring contribution was the development of a writing system that became the ancestor of almost every alphabet in use today. The Phoenician alphabet, developed around 1050 BCE, was a significant innovation over earlier writing systems. Where cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics were complex systems with hundreds or thousands of signs, many representing whole words or syllables. The Phoenician alphabet used only 22 symbols, each representing a consonant sound. This made it far easier to learn and use. Instead of memorizing hundreds of complex signs, a writer needed to learn only 22 symbols. Literacy became more accessible. The system could be used to write any language, not just the specific language for which it was invented. The Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet and added vowel signs, which Phoenician lacked. From the Greek alphabet descended the Latin alphabet, which became the writing system of the Roman Empire and, through Rome, of most of Western Europe, and eventually of many other parts of the world. From the Phoenician alphabet also descended the Hebrew and Aramaic alphabets, and from Aramaic, the Arabic script, and ultimately the scripts of many languages across Central and South Asia. Nearly every writing system that uses an alphabet, whether the Latin letters of English, the Cyrillic letters of Russian, the Greek letters of modern Greece, the Arabic script, the Hebrew script, the Devanagari of Hindi, traces its origins to that small set of 22 Phoenician consonant signs developed on the Lebanese coast 3,000 years ago. The alphabet is perhaps the single most influential technology ever developed by human beings, and it came from the Phoenicians. Ancient Rome had a complicated relationship with its own emperors. Being Roman emperor was one of the most dangerous jobs in history. Of the first 37 emperors of Rome, roughly 2/3 died violently, killed by rivals, soldiers, or their own guards. The problem was structural. There was no clear, agreed-upon mechanism for imperial succession. The emperor was, in theory, chosen by the Senate, but in practice, power went to whoever had the military support to take it and the political skill to keep it. This created constant insecurity. Every emperor knew that his position depended on the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who protected the emperor and who were stationed in Rome. The Guard became kingmakers. They assassinated emperors they disliked and elevated emperors they preferred. In 193 CE, in an episode called The Year of the Five Emperors, 4 emperors were killed in a single year as different military factions backed different candidates. And yet, some emperors managed to rule for decades and die of natural causes. Augustus ruled for 44 years. Hadrian ruled for 21 years. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, ruled for 19 years. These long reigns required extraordinary political skill, genuine popularity, military success, and considerable luck. The Roman public had a complex relationship with the institution of emperor. They had lived under a republic for centuries before Augustus. The word emperor was carefully avoided. Augustus called himself princeps, meaning first citizen. The fiction that Rome was still a republic, with the emperor merely its leading citizen, was maintained for generations, even as reality made it increasingly hollow. Rome simultaneously idealized the republic it had lost, celebrated the stability that strong emperors provided, and periodically tried to assassinate those emperors when they became intolerable. It was a complicated political culture. The ancient world had international law. It was not called that, but the concept that there should be rules governing the conduct of states toward each other, rules that applied even in warfare, is ancient. Ancient Mesopotamia had treaties between city-states and kingdoms, inscribed on clay tablets, that laid out the terms of peace, the obligations of each party, and the consequences of violations. The gods were invoked as witnesses and guarantors. Breaking a treaty was not just a political act, it was an impiety, a violation of a divine compact. Ancient India developed sophisticated theories of statecraft, war, and diplomacy in texts like the Artha Shastra attributed to Kautilya around 300 BCE. The text discusses when it is appropriate to make war and when to make peace, the ethics of military conduct, and the obligations of rulers toward both their own people and foreign states. Ancient Greece developed norms around the treatment of heralds and ambassadors. Heralds were considered sacred under the protection of the god Hermes. Killing or harming a herald was a serious violation of divine law, and ancient sources show that even bitter enemies generally respected the person of heralds, even while fighting bitter wars. The Greeks also recognized the concept of asylum, the idea that certain sacred spaces provided protection to those who took refuge in them. A fugitive who reached the sanctuary of a temple could not be dragged out and killed without violating divine law. Rome developed the concept of just war, the idea that warfare required legitimate cause and legitimate conduct. Augustine, writing in the 5th century CE, drew on these Roman traditions in developing the Christian just war theory that would shape European thinking about war for centuries. The idea that even warfare has rules, that there are things you must not do, even to your enemy, is ancient. It has never been perfectly observed. It is not perfectly observed today. But the idea itself, the aspiration toward rules that constrain even violence, goes back thousands of years. Ancient Chinese medicine understood the circulation of blood. The Western claim that William Harvey discovered the circulation of blood in 1628 is entirely correct within the Western medical tradition. Harvey's work was a genuine breakthrough that overturned centuries of Greek-derived medical theory in Europe. But ancient Chinese medicine had understood something about the circulation of blood and vital energy through the body for much longer. The Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's classic of medicine, compiled over centuries, but with roots going back perhaps to the 2nd century BCE, describes a system of channels through which blood and vital energy, qi, circulate continuously through the body. The text explicitly states that blood moves in a continuous circuit, always flowing, never stopping. This is not identical to Harvey's discovery, which was based on dissection and quantitative reasoning about the volume of blood and the function of the valves in the heart. The Chinese understanding was embedded in a different theoretical framework, one that included concepts like qi and the balance of yin and yang that do not correspond to Western anatomy. But the core observation, that blood circulates continuously through the body in a closed circuit, was present in Chinese medicine long before it was recognized in the West. This is one of many examples where the history of science is more complex than the simple narrative of Western discovery might suggest. Many ideas that appear in the Western tradition as breakthroughs were known in other forms in other traditions, sometimes much earlier. Ancient knowledge was not always transmitted across cultures. Parallel discoveries were made independently. The story of human understanding is not a single river, but a delta. Multiple streams flowing in different directions, sometimes joining, sometimes diverging, carrying similar insights in different forms. The Romans built roads so well that some still exist today. The Roman road network at its peak extended approximately 250,000 miles, or 400,000 kilometers, across the empire. These roads connected every significant city and military outpost, allowing the rapid movement of soldiers, supplies, and official communications. Roman roads were not simply paths worn into the ground. They were engineered structures built in layers. A typical major road had a foundation of large, flat stones, then a layer of smaller stones, then a layer of gravel and sand, topped with large, flat paving stones fitted closely together. Drainage ditches ran along the sides. Milestones marked distances. The construction was so robust that sections of Roman roads survive today, not just as archaeological features, but as active roads. The Via Appia, the Appian Way, built beginning in 312 BCE to connect Rome to the south of Italy, still runs from Rome to Brindisi, nearly 570 kilometers. Parts of the original Roman paving are still visible and walkable. Many modern European roads follow the routes of Roman roads, and in some cases run directly on top of the original Roman surface. The alignment of roads in Britain, France, Spain, and other former Roman provinces often reflects the engineering decisions made by Roman surveyors 2,000 years ago. The Roman road system was one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, and it was built not primarily for trade or tourism, but for military purposes. The roads existed to move legions quickly to wherever they were needed. They were instruments of empire, but they were also instruments of connection, of commerce, of the spread of ideas and people and goods. The roads that moved legions also moved merchants, pilgrims, students, missionaries, and wanderers. They connected a vast and diverse empire in ways that made possible the remarkable cultural exchange that characterized Rome at its height. Ancient Mesopotamia had fairy tales. Some of the oldest stories ever recorded are from ancient Mesopotamia, and they are recognizably stories in the sense we understand. They have characters and plots and moral lessons and moments of humor and surprise. The collection of Sumerian stories includes tales that have parallels with stories we know from much later traditions. There are flood narratives, a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, with a single righteous man warned to build a boat and save animals, that predate the biblical story of Noah by centuries. Scholars debate the relationship between these stories and the degree to which one tradition influenced another. There are stories of heroes and monsters, of journeys to the underworld, of gods who fall in love and cause catastrophe. There are trickster tales, stories in which cleverness defeats brute force. There are stories about the proper behavior of children toward parents and of students toward teachers. There are also jokes. Ancient Mesopotamian collections include riddles and puzzles that were clearly meant to be funny. Some work across the centuries, their humor still recognizable. Others require cultural context we no longer have. The oldest written joke we know of dates to approximately 1900 BCE from ancient Sumeria. It reads, "Something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap." The joke is approximately 4,000 years old. It is still recognizable as a joke. The category of humor it represents, the subversion of expectations about propriety, is one we still use. The ancient world was funny. People laughed. They told stories that were meant to entertain as well as instruct. They collected jokes and riddles. They performed plays. The oldest surviving plays are the works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes from 5th century BCE Athens. Aristophanes wrote comedies that included slapstick, wordplay, political satire, and sexually explicit humor. They were performed before large audiences. People went to the theater to laugh. The ancient world had entertainment. It had humor. It had storytelling for its own sake. It had the full range of human creative expression. It was, in this way, fully human. Ancient peoples made art for the same reasons we do. The oldest known figurative art, cave paintings and small sculptures, dates back roughly 40,000 to 50,000 years. These are not the products of ancient civilizations in the historical sense. They predate writing and cities by tens of thousands of years. But they are art, recognizable as art. The animals painted on cave walls in Lascaux and Chauvet are rendered with skill and attention to detail that indicates extended practice and genuine aesthetic intention. The placement of figures, the use of the cave's natural contours to give three-dimensional effect to painted animals, the repetition of certain subjects, all suggest that these paintings were not random marks but intentional visual creations. What were they for? We do not know. They may have been ritual. They may have been commemorative. They may have been educational, passing on knowledge about animals to younger hunters. They may have been simply beautiful, made because the maker found beauty in making them. The continuity between ancient art and modern art is striking. The same subjects appear across thousands of years of human art making. Animals, humans, hands, the sky, the narrative of a chase or a battle or a celebration, the face of a beloved person, the body in motion. These subjects are not arbitrary. They reflect the things that matter most to human beings, the animals that sustain us and threaten us, the people we love and fear, the world we inhabit and try to understand. Ancient artists were not primitive. They were making art for reasons we still make art. Because beauty matters. Because making something lasting matters. Because putting the inner world into visible form, sharing it, leaving it behind, is a deeply human impulse. The oldest art is a message from a human mind to other human minds across thousands of years. And it still works. We still feel it. We still recognize it as art. The ancient world took dreams seriously. In virtually every ancient culture we know of, dreams were considered significant. Not just pleasant or disturbing experiences to be forgotten in the morning, but messages, warnings, prophecies, visitations from gods or the dead. The ancient Egyptians had professional dream interpreters and texts describing the meanings of different types of dreams. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, dating to around 1275 BCE, contains an extensive dream dictionary, listing hundreds of dream images and their interpretations. Ancient Mesopotamia had similar traditions. Dream reports appear in royal inscriptions and personal letters. Kings sought the interpretation of significant dreams. The god Marduk was believed to communicate through dreams. In ancient Greece, the god of dreams was Hypnos, and his son Morpheus shaped the dreams of mortals. The oracle at Delphi, the most important religious institution in the ancient Greek world, was associated with dreams and vision. Dream incubation, sleeping in sacred spaces in the hope of receiving a divine dream, was practiced at temples across the Greek world. In the ancient world, a significant dream required response. It was treated as a piece of information from a source beyond the dreamer, requiring interpretation and possibly action. Royal dreams were recorded and consulted. We no longer generally treat dreams as prophetic. We understand them as products of the brain's own processing during sleep. Images and narratives generated from memory, emotion, and random neural activity. But the attention the ancient world paid to dreams reflects something true. Dreams are vivid. They feel significant. They carry emotional weight. The experience of a powerful dream, waking with a residue of terror or joy or strangeness that persists through the day, is genuinely compelling. The ancient interpretation that dreams come from outside, from gods or the dead or the future, was wrong in the literal sense. But the impulse to take that experience seriously, to look for meaning in it, was not unreasonable given what they knew. They were paying attention to their inner lives. They were taking their own experience seriously. That impulse is not wrong. Only some of the interpretations were. The night is deep now. You have traveled far tonight, through the great cities of the ancient world, through their temples and markets and courts and kitchens, through their laws and their jokes and their dreams, through the lives of people who built extraordinary things and worried about ordinary things, and asked the same questions about the universe and death and justice that we are still asking. The ancient world is not gone. It is in the language you speak and the numbers you use and the laws you live under and the stories you tell and the way you understand your own existence. It is in the very idea that a life can be lived with intention, with meaning, with the aspiration towards something better than what came before. Every generation inherits from the last and builds, however imperfectly, on what was left. The ancient Egyptians built on what came before them. The Greeks built on Egypt and Mesopotamia. Rome built on Greece. The medieval world built on Rome. The modern world built on all of it, and is itself being built upon right now by the future that is coming. You are in the middle of this chain, not at the end, not at the beginning. In the middle, receiving what was given and passing on what you make, whether or not you ever think of it that way. The ancient peoples are your ancestors, not necessarily by blood, though perhaps by that too, but by culture, by idea, by the slow accumulation of human learning that has been passed from generation to generation for thousands of years. They wanted the same things you want: to be safe, to be loved, to understand the world, to leave something behind, to feel that their brief time here mattered. It mattered. It all mattered. And so does yours. If you happen to still be awake, you can go ahead and watch the next chapter now. And if your eyes are heavy, let them close. The ancient world has been waiting for you to rest. It is patient. It has been waiting for thousands of years. Sleep well. Dream softly. Good night. Ancient India gave the world the number 0. It is difficult to overstate how important this is. 0 is not just a number. It is the concept that makes modern mathematics possible. Without 0, there is no algebra in the form we know it. There is no calculus. There is no computer science, which is built on binary code, the alternation of ones and zeros. The Babylonians and Mayans had placeholder zeros, symbols used to indicate an empty position in a number. But the concept of 0 as a number in its own right, a number that could be added and subtracted and used in calculations, was developed in ancient India. The mathematician Brahmagupta in the 7th century CE was the first to formally define 0 as a number and describe its mathematical properties. He described what happens when you add 0 to a number, when you subtract 0, when you multiply by zero. His treatment of zero as a legitimate mathematical quantity, not just a placeholder, was a conceptual breakthrough. The concept traveled from India to the Islamic world, where mathematicians further developed it, and from the Islamic world to Europe, where it eventually replaced the Roman numeral system that had no zero and was extraordinarily cumbersome for calculation. The word zero itself comes from the Arabic sifr, which comes from the Sanskrit sunya, meaning empty. Every calculation you have ever done in your life, every price, every measurement, every computation of any kind, rests on a concept developed in ancient India. The number that means nothing is the foundation of everything. Ancient Egypt had female pharaohs. The most famous is Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1478 to 1458 BCE. She was one of the most successful pharaohs in Egyptian history, male or female. Hatshepsut was the wife of Thutmose II. When he died, their son, Thutmose III, was too young to rule alone, and Hatshepsut served as regent. But within a few years, she took the full title of pharaoh, the first woman to do so in centuries. She ruled for approximately 20 years. During her reign, Egypt was prosperous and peaceful. She organized a famous trading expedition to the land of Punt, bringing back exotic goods including myrrh trees, ebony, and live animals. She built extensively, including the magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which is considered one of the great architectural achievements of ancient Egypt. She was depicted in traditional male pharaonic regalia, including the false beard worn by pharaohs, though other representations show her as female. The question of how she navigated the gendered expectations of the pharaonic role is one that scholars continue to discuss. After her death, many of her images and inscriptions were destroyed or defaced, apparently by her successor, Thutmose III, or his son. For centuries, her existence was essentially erased from the record, her accomplishments attributed to male rulers. In the 19th century, when Egyptologists began to decipher hieroglyphics and study ancient records more systematically, Hatshepsut was rediscovered. Her story is now one of the most celebrated in Egyptology. She was not alone. Sobekneferu, who ruled around 1800 BCE, is the earliest confirmed female pharaoh. Nefertiti, wife of Akhenaten, may have ruled in her own right after his death. Cleopatra is the most famous. Female rule was not common in ancient Egypt, but it was possible, and when it occurred, the women who achieved it were, by the evidence of what they left behind, fully capable of the role. Ancient Rome had graffiti. Pompeii, again, is the treasure house of this evidence. The eruption of Vesuvius preserved not just the buildings and objects of the city, but the writing on its walls. Thousands of inscriptions scratched or painted onto the plaster surfaces of buildings throughout the city. And the writing on the walls of Pompeii is not primarily official or religious or commercial. It is personal. It is human. It is, in many cases, exactly what you might expect to find on the walls of a busy city if its inhabitants had been given free rein to express themselves. There are declarations of love. I love the girl whose name is written on this wall. There are insults. There are political endorsements, candidates for local office recommended by their supporters in painted announcements. There are jokes. There are boasts. There are messages that seem to be inside jokes between friends. There are reviews of local establishments. One ancient reviewer noted that a particular establishment's wine was drinkable, but had something of the taste of seawater. Another wrote simply that the food was terrible. There is poetry. Fragments of Virgil and other poets appear, sometimes accurately quoted and sometimes mangled, suggesting school children or people with imperfect memories. There is original poetry too, clearly composed by the person writing it, varying in quality from genuinely moving to unintentionally hilarious. There are announcements of upcoming gladiatorial games, with the names of featured fighters and the dates of events. There are advertisements for rental properties and slaves for sale. Reading the graffiti of Pompeii is like overhearing the conversation of a city. Not the official version, not the history that was deliberately recorded and preserved, but the informal, personal, often trivial, sometimes profound expression of ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, pausing to scratch something onto a wall. It is the most intimate evidence we have of ancient life, and it sounds remarkably familiar. Ancient civilizations mapped the stars long before telescopes. The astronomical knowledge of the ancient world is one of its most remarkable achievements. Without any optical instruments, using only patient naked eye observation over decades and centuries, ancient astronomers achieved levels of understanding that are astonishing. The ancient Babylonians tracked the movements of the planets with considerable accuracy, developing mathematical models that could predict planetary positions years in advance. They recorded eclipses systematically and discovered the Saros cycle, the approximately 18-year cycle after which solar and lunar eclipses repeat. This discovery allowed them to predict eclipses with reasonable accuracy. The ancient Egyptians oriented their monuments to celestial alignments with great precision. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north to within a small fraction of a degree. Some temples were oriented to capture the rays of the sun on specific days of the year, particularly the solstices, or the days associated with specific gods. The ancient Greeks built on Babylonian astronomy and made their own contributions. Hipparchus, in the 2nd century BCE, discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the celestial pole to trace a circle over approximately 26,000 years. He compiled a star catalogue with positions accurate to within a degree for hundreds of stars. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek device discovered in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece, dates to approximately 100 BCE. It is a complex mechanical calculator with dozens of interlocking bronze gears, designed to predict the positions of the sun and moon, track the phases of the moon, and calculate the dates of upcoming eclipses. It is the most sophisticated mechanical device known from the ancient world, and nothing comparable is known to have existed until the medieval period. Ancient people did not look at the sky with ignorance. They looked at it with intelligence, patience, and remarkable mathematical sophistication. The sky was their clock, their calendar, their navigational tool, and their theological map. They had every reason to study it carefully. And they did. The ancient world produced philosophers whose ideas are still debated today. Socrates, who lived in Athens in the 5th century BCE, never wrote a word. Everything we know about him comes from the writings of his students, particularly Plato. Yet his influence on Western philosophy has been so profound that Alfred North Whitehead famously described all of Western philosophy as a series of footnotes to Plato. Socrates developed what became known as the Socratic method, the practice of asking questions rather than making assertions, drawing out the implications of a position, exposing contradictions, and forcing the interlocutor to think more carefully about what they actually believe. It is still the dominant method of philosophical inquiry and is widely used in law schools, where it is called the Socratic method explicitly. Aristotle, Plato's student, was perhaps the most comprehensive intellectual in history. He wrote on logic, physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetry, biology, and other subjects. His works shaped Western thought for nearly 2,000 years. In medieval Europe, he was simply called the philosopher, as if there were no need to specify which one. The ancient Indian philosopher Chanakya, roughly contemporary with Aristotle, wrote extensively on statecraft, economics, and military strategy in the Artha Shastra, a text so sophisticated in its analysis of power that it has been compared to Machiavelli and Sun Tzu. The ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius, who lived in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, developed ideas about ethics, governance, family relationships, and education that shaped Chinese culture so profoundly that their influence is still visible in contemporary Chinese society, 2,500 years later. The ancient world did not just build monuments and fight wars. It thought. It asked hard questions about how to live, about what is real, about what is good and just, about how societies should be organized and how individuals should treat each other. And the answers it came up with, contested and varied, and sometimes wrong, and sometimes genuinely wise, are still part of the conversation, still being debated, still shaping how we think. Now the ancient world recedes, gently, into the dark. The civilizations we have visited tonight are gone. Their languages, most of them, are no longer spoken. Their gods are no longer worshipped. Their cities are buried under modern cities, or under sand, or under the slow accumulation of centuries. But they are not nothing. They are the accumulated inheritance of humanity, the slow-built foundation on which everything subsequent has rested, the long experiment in figuring out how to be human together, how to build something that lasts, how to pass knowledge from one generation to the next, how to face the unknown with curiosity rather than only with fear. The ancient peoples did not succeed at everything. They failed in many ways, some minor and some catastrophic. But they tried, they built, they thought. They asked questions and wrote down the answers and argued about them, and sometimes changed their minds. That trying, that building, that asking is the most human thing there is, and it connects you across the vast distance of time to every person who has ever looked at the world and wanted to understand it. Tonight, you are part of that long tradition, not by anything you have done, but simply by being here, awake or nearly asleep, carrying the accumulated inheritance of all those ancient lives in the language you think in and the categories through which you understand the world. You are the living continuation of something very old and very large and still ongoing. Rest now. The ancient world is patient. It has been waiting for thousands of years. It will wait a little longer while you sleep.